right. Well, we're gonna, as people filter in, we'll remind them that we're gonna record this so that it's available to press after we're done. And also in the chat is a link to a Dropbox which has the presentation that we're going to be using today, as well as some of the exhibits that were presented at trial. So I will get going, and then we'll make the recording available to everybody at the end. My name is William Most. I'm an attorney for the plaintiffs in Imani, the city of Baton Rouge. I'm joined here today by our legal team, which is John Adcock, David Lancer, and Veronica Barnes. And we're joined today as well by several of the 14 plaintiffs in that case. So we have Victor Onaha, Alicia Feldman, Daniel Liebeskind, Karen Savage, and Nadia Salazar Sandy. And so we welcome you to this press conference because we wanted to let you know about what has happened and what the resolution of this case was, because it's been fairly dramatic. So this is a case, we represent the plaintiffs, who are 2 journalists and 12 protesters who were, all of them, arrested by the Baton Rouge Police Department on July 10th, 2016. And in 2017, they filed a lawsuit in federal court in the Middle District of Louisiana, arguing that their constitutional rights had been violated by the police department when they were arrested and imprisoned, and had, as we'll talk about, evidence about them fabricated to put them in prison. And that case resolved yesterday. We have been in trial since the beginning of this month, and the trial, as it was continuing, the parties began settlement negotiations, or continued settlement negotiations, because of the dramatic nature of the evidence that was produced at trial. And that negotiation culminated in yesterday, a settlement between the plaintiffs and the defendants of $1.17 million to be paid by the city of Baton Rouge, which is quite extraordinary an outcome. It is a very large settlement for the region, and it reflects the extremely significant nature of what happened at the trial, which I'm going to go through. So the case this morning, it was scheduled for closing arguments to begin this morning at 9 a.m., but the Baton Rouge City Council, which is called the Metro Council, yesterday evening approved the settlement. And so the case has now been resolved and will not be sent to the jury for decision. So what I'm going to do is, in this conference, we're going to run quickly through a presentation that shouldn't take too long, highlighting some of the key things that happened at trial and provide you with some of the key evidence. And then we're going to open it up for questions, and as well as allow any plaintiffs who wish to say anything they want, but do not have to. So we're going to go through the evidence, answer questions, and have any final discussion. And then everything we have here today will be made available to the press, and you can also ask us for additional materials if you'd like them. So unless anyone has any, and we are also joined by Blair Imani, the named plaintiff in the case. All right, so the case is Imani v. Baton Rouge. And the background of this case is that on July 5th, 2016, a Baton Rouge police officer shot a Baton Rouge resident to death. And because of the shocking nature of the killing, there were peaceful protests that happened in that city over the next couple days. And when these slides that are highlighted in red, this comes from the agreed upon facts. So this is in the Dropbox as Joint Exhibit 20. And these are the facts that there was no dispute about even before the trial began, the parties agreed on. And the plaintiffs in this case all were arrested on July 10th, 2016. On that day, there was a scheduled march and protest in downtown Baton Rouge. The Baton Rouge Police Department treated it as though it had a permit, because the immediate nature of what was going on did not allow for the time to get a permit. And the group marched from a church on Government Street up to the state capitol building, and this depicts the group at the state capitol building, where there was peaceful discussion, vigil, and prayer. And then the group marched south again. And when they marched south, they then turned onto Government Street and were directed by the police to turn off of that street towards East Boulevard and France Street, an intersection, a more less trafficked intersection. The protesters were told to go there by the Baton Rouge Police Department. And then once at that intersection, the RPD gave them the order to clear the streets. And every single plaintiff in this case obeyed that command. And as you can see, moved out of the streets onto the sidewalks and also into the yard here that you can see at East and France, which was the home of Lisa Batiste, who gave the protesters permission to stand in her yard. And as you can see, the plaintiffs were part of this group. You can see many of them identified here in this photo. Now, it's an agreed upon fact in this case that according to the city of Baton Rouge, any protester who complies with an order to clear the streets should not be arrested. And so it would be expected that all the people in the group we just saw in the picture there would not be arrested, because that's agreed that it should not happen. But it did. Every single one of the 14 plaintiffs in this case, 2 journalists, 12 protesters, were arrested by BRPD. Even though there's an audio recording of the BRPD at the time saying, "They are out of the road, that's all we ask." You can hear it. Now, this is a conversation between a legal observer who is attempting to de-escalate the situation and a ranking police officer on the scene. And so the protesters were told, just be out of the road, that's all we ask. But BRPD arrested every single one of the plaintiffs, even though they cleared the roadways and complied with police orders. Now, at trial, the Baton Rouge Police Department conceded that they did not have any evidence that any of the plaintiffs, I'm just gonna mute, let's see. So this is a chart that represents some of the evidence that was presented at trial. An officer on the stand answered the questions in each of these boxes and admitted that the city did not have any evidence that any plaintiff failed to comply with orders, although that is what they were arrested for, as we'll see. The plaintiffs were arrested if they stayed in the yard where they had permission to be. These pins represent the 10 plaintiffs who were arrested in Ms. Batiste's yard. But they were also arrested if they left. The police initially gave commands to get out of the street, which plaintiffs complied with, then get off the sidewalks, which plaintiffs complied with, and then they were told to disperse. And the testimony at trial was that was impossible to comply with, because you cannot both stay out of the streets and disperse from the area, because the only way to leave the area would be by crossing the streets. But the police arrested the plaintiffs whether they stayed in the yard or left. So 10 were arrested in the yard, 4 were arrested in other areas. You can see Karen Savage left, went several blocks away, was arrested in the parking lot of McDonald's. Antonio Castanon Luna and Nadia Salazar Sandy were simply standing on a street corner. They were trying to get back to their car, but they couldn't because the police were in the way. They were arrested on a street corner. And Alexis Swope, who was only 17 at the time, was arrested here. And the reason why, we know why everyone was arrested regardless of where they were, because we have audio recordings of the police officers communicating with each other. And that was transcribed. And an officer, Wallace, who's one of the defendants in the case, ordered that everyone has violated, everyone is under arrest. That's defendant David Wallace. He directed the officers over the radio to apprehend anyone else that's violating, which is everybody out there, regardless of where they were standing. And that's what the officers did. This is a video depicting it. So you can see that despite this being private property, where
Washington have adopted policies that restrict hookups to all. Is it going on? Is it happening?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. I'll get through the presentation and then I'll open up for questions. So this shows that the officers entered private property. They had no warrant to enter private property, even though a warrant is required. They entered private property and began arresting people. They began pushing people off the porch. And so I'm just going to run through a couple of the plaintiffs to highlight what happened here. So Karen Savage and Sharif Foytlin, who are here, were the two journalists present who were arrested. It's an undisputed fact. The parties agreed that Ms. Savage identified herself as a journalist to the officers, but they arrested her nonetheless. In fact, they chased her several blocks away and arrested her in the McDonald's parking lot. Sharif Foytlin was likewise arrested while she was taking photographs. Ray Pollard and Sonny Hayes, who are depicted here, were standing, you can see from this photo, were told to be out of the street, and not only were they out of the street, they were not even on the sidewalk, but they were violently arrested by BRPD officers. There were several law enforcement agencies present on scene, but the testimony at trial was that they were all acting under the joint command of the Baton Rouge Police Department. So these are state troopers acting at the direction of Baton Rouge Police Department. Blair Imani and Akeem Muhammad were former LSU students. They were each violently seized, placed on the ground, their hands put in flex cuffs, and then they were imprisoned. Nadia Salazar Sandy and Antonio Castanon Luna had left the area, were trying to get back to their car, but were prevented from doing so by a police barricade, and were standing on the street corner when three officers violently tackled them to the ground and arrested both of them. Alexis Swope was only 17 years at the time, was passing through Baton Rouge with her mother, her brother, and their dog. She was standing on the street corner, out of the street, was arrested. Her mother was arrested, her dog was taken into animal control, and her little brother was put into Child Protective Services. It took several days for the family to reunite. Victor Onaha was likewise trying to get back to his car, but was prevented from doing so by the police, and so had to remain at Easton, France, and he was arrested as well. Now, what is particularly disturbing about this, many aspects of it are disturbing, but for each of the plaintiffs, an officer signed what's called an affidavit of probable cause. And that's a legal document which is signed by an officer under oath, which says, this is what this person did to be arrested, this is why they were arrested, this is the crime, and here's what justifies their arrest. And these documents are important for, among other reasons, because a person can't be booked into the parish prison without this or an arrest warrant, and there were no arrest warrants. So each of the plaintiffs had one of these. Now, of course, typically an affidavit is filled out after someone has been accused of committing a crime, because you don't know what someone's going to do until they do it. An officer typically can only write down what they arrested someone for after that has happened. But in these protests in July 2016, Baton Rouge Police Department did something that it testified it has never done before and never done since, which is it wrote the accusations of the crime in advance. The reason why we know this is because we have the emails that showed that they wrote them in advance, circulated them by email, and then distributed them to officers on the scene. So each of the plaintiffs has an almost identical description of what they were accused of doing. But none of it was true. And in fact, two officers, when asked about whether the contents of these sworn documents were true, refused to answer and instead pled the fifth because they were concerned that their answers to our questions might incriminate them in a crime. Because the reality is, none of this was truthful, and many parts of it they knew were false, and they so testified on the stand. Because what happened was, Baton Rouge Police Department set up a system. They planned it in advance, according to one of the witnesses at trial, where certain officers were seizing people on the scene. They would then hand the arrestee off to another officer, who would then hand the arrestee off to a third officer, who would then sign the affidavits of probable cause. But by design, by the policy of the city of Baton Rouge, there was no communication between those officers. So the last officer received a person, but had no idea what that person was accused of having done. But they still signed these affidavits of probable cause under oath, saying they did very specific things, without having any basis to know whether that was true or not. And many parts of it were absolutely false. For example, you can see in here, it describes the location as 9000 Airline Highway. That is about 5 miles away in Baton Rouge. These affidavits also say the signing officer is the one who caused the arrest, but that wasn't true for any of the arrestees. And that's one of the things you can see that prompted officers to plead the fifth, because they acknowledged that they had known that the contents of these documents were false, but they signed them under oath anyway. That is, of course, perjury. So 2 officers acknowledged at trial that they pled the fifth to a number of questions. Questions like, did you commit perjury? Did you commit fabrication of false evidence? Did you commit false imprisonment? Willie Williams, defendant Willie Williams, an officer of the BRPD, did the same. And this is extraordinary. In none of the careers of our legal team have we ever had a trial where there was officers pleading the fifth. And expert Robert Pusins testified that in his 35 years of experience as an officer and an expert, he had never seen officers plead the fifth in a civil trial. And pleading the fifth is a defense in a criminal case. It can't be held against you. Or it's not a defense, but it can't be held against you in a criminal case. But that's not true in a civil case. In a civil case, if you plead the fifth, the jury can draw an inference that your answer would incriminate you in a crime. And it gets worse. So not only were there officers like Willie Williams and like Jonathan Abity who were signing their name to documents they knew to be untrue, but there were also officers out there forging other officers' names. So for example, this says here Walker and has a badge number for Billy Walker. But Billy Walker testified at this trial and said that's not his signature, which is corroborated by the fact that in 2016, he sent a letter saying to his superior officers saying, someone is out there forging my names. He says, note that the printed and signed name on the affidavit wasn't done by me. Similarly, another officer, Rehab Simino, said that his name was forged on numerous affidavits of probable cause. And he also reported up the chain of command. But there was no investigation at all by the city of Baton Rouge or the Baton Rouge Police Department into these forgeries. So this was a dramatic trial. It went on, it began at the beginning of this month, and it was scheduled for closing arguments this morning. There were a number of dramatic moments. And I'm just going to go through them quickly, and we can answer questions or provide you information later. So for example, a Baton Rouge Police Department representative admitted that BRPD applied its punitive civil unrest policy to the protesters because of the content of their speech. He was asked on the stand, was this because of the content of their speech? He said yes. Also, in many of the videos, although not the ones we've seen, you can see the officers, they bring in what's called a Bearcat, which is an 8-ton quasi-military vehicle. And on top of it was what's called an LRAD weapon, which is an acronym for Long Range Acoustical Device. And BRPD used this weapon, a less than lethal sonic weapon, on the protesters, even though they had never used it before, ever. They had done no safety training with it, did not even have a safety manual. This range on protesters. An officer on the stand at trial described it as messing around with the weapon they were using on protesters at close range. Another dramatic moment was when a Baton Rouge Police Department Internal Affairs supervisor testified that they had not investigated any officer for any conduct related to these protests, not the forgery of documents, not the signing of false statements under oath, not excessive force, not false arrest. There were no investigations whatsoever, with one sole exception, which was BRPD officer Marcus Thompson, who said out loud, "We are violating these protesters' constitutional rights." And he was reported by two other officers and investigated by Internal Affairs for saying that they were violating constitutional rights. That is the only investigation that occurred whatsoever. It was also dramatic that there was testimony at trial that the then chief of police, Carl Dabadie, gave an advance order that every internal affairs investigator for the city of New Orleans was to stay at the office and not go to the protests. And it was completely unexplained why he would give that order. And then one reason we think that there is significant nationwide impact of this is that a BRPD officer testified at trial, a former officer, a representative of the Baton Rouge Police Department, testified that the city was not ashamed of this conduct. The police department was not ashamed of this conduct. Instead, Leach testified that he was flown around the country to other police departments, and he gave a list of police departments where he was training and debriefing other police departments in how they did it in Baton Rouge. And so these methods that were obviously unconstitutional and illegal were used to train other departments around the country. So those are the top line elements. I'm going to open it up for questions, and then we're going to see if any of our plaintiffs or the rest of the legal team would like to say anything. But let's see what questions anybody might have. You can just unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, hey, I have one. I don't know if you're going to know the full answer to this one, but do you know how, because there was a lot of arrests in this weekend of all these events. Do you know how many settlements the city has signed off on? Because I know this isn't the first one.
Yeah. So there were about 200 arrests over the days after the killing of Alton Sterling. And for almost all of them, with I think a handful of exceptions, the district attorney declined to prosecute any of them. And there was a class action lawsuit brought on behalf of about half of the protesters that settled, I think maybe within a year or so after the protests. And then there have been a number of other smaller lawsuits, of which this is the largest one with 14 plaintiffs. So there were several other settlements of individual cases in addition to the settlement of the class action. Anybody else have any questions? And I'm putting back into the chat, this is a link to a Dropbox that has the presentation I just gave, as well as some other documents. There's also plaintiff's complaint in there, which is the initiating document of the lawsuit, which describes much of it, and also plaintiff's motion for summary judgment, which is a document where we sort of wove together a lot of the evidence that had been gathered in the case. Okay, I'll open up. Now, we've provided in our press release some statements by plaintiffs, which of course you can use. Does anybody else from our team or the plaintiffs want to add anything I'm missing here that you think is significant?
I would, if possible.
Yeah, please. That's Dr. Daniel Liebeskin, one of the plaintiffs in this case.
Hi, sorry for the no eye contact. I am on my way to work. It's the thing I kept on repeating, asking every meeting I would have with y'all, with John Adcock, is that the reason why this is so important is that this should never have been allowed to happen, and it should never be allowed to happen again. And whatever can be done to leverage all of the evidence that you all have done such an amazing job of bringing up, whatever you can do to, whatever could be done to leverage that so that police departments and officers are less likely to do this, or that there are policy changes, that would be true justice. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. And I'll add to that that what was particularly concerning to many of us is that not only were there no investigations, except for the one officer who spoke up against the constitutional violations, but to our knowledge, there have not been any policy changes or any sort of reckoning or any sort of understanding that wrong was done and a desire to do better. We have not seen evidence of that. And so part of the value of this case was to show the misconduct in the hopes of deterring it in the future.
And I could just add something small. I'm an organizing director. This is my life's career. This is what I do. I organize for and with communities since I was 16, really in undocumented and scared. And I found myself through the undocumented, unafraid struggle, which connected me to community. And so going out that day on July 10th changed my perspective and really stopped me in my tracks and halted my life. I can't imagine the consequences of other types of police brutality to other people, especially in the community of Baton Rouge. So I'm glad to see that there was a resolution, some accountability, but also I want this to be a message to people that your voice needs to be heard, that there is space, that you have rights, and that no one's going to stop fighting for them. Just like us, we went through 7 years of this struggle, and I can speak for myself, I would do it again if it meant that other people can also exercise their First Amendment rights.
Yeah, I'll note that the plaintiff's testimony, each of the 14 plaintiffs testified in this trial, and their testimony was extremely compelling to the point where, at least during Nadia's testimony, at least one juror was crying, was visibly crying because of the emotional impact of the stories that were being told.
I actually interrupt again. I'm sorry. Nadia, you specifically, I'm at WBRZ and I was overlooking all the raw footage that we shot that day. And I see you, and I'm assuming it's your brother or whoever else you were arrested with, standing there on the corner. And I even hear a cop say the guy in the white shorts talking about who you were standing next to. And then I can see them running over and grabbing you guys. And I guess, were you injured during that and everything too?
So, funny story. That's my ex-husband.
Oh, okay.
A co-plaintiff. But no, his knee was hurt. His ankle was also hurt. I believe I remember his foot like swelled up and like it was swollen up out of his shoe. He's a bigger guy. So it made no sense to me how he got injured, which means I obviously got injured too. And you saw the footage, is many police officers that came out of the bush. And like, this is honestly the first time I've actually verbally heard someone say that we were directly targeted. So I'm actually in shock because I felt that in that moment and saw them signaling. But to hear that this was so intentional is just, it scares me to my core. I mean, many of us experience death threats after this. Many of us experience many things for just exercising our rights. And wow, to know that we were targeted it's huge.
And yeah, this is Blair, Imani. I wanted to second that. I think that one of the things that has been the most devastating, in addition to the emotional distress, has been the distrust that was created after kind of the narrative from police. I think that this settlement sends a really clear message that the narrative about an unruly crowd was completely baseless, that we were peaceful protesters who complied with orders and who were illegally arrested regardless. So I look forward to kind of like healing and mending relationships in the Baton Rouge area and just being able to be like a regular LSU alumni who can go back to like football games. I also really want to lift up that William Most of Most and Associates and John Adcock as well. Like, I think it wasn't until they had reached out to us in 2017 that a lot of us realized kind of like the depth of the injustice. I think that a lot of people, like everyday Americans, experience police brutality, and for those of us who survive it, we're just kind of happy to get away with our lives. And so to be able to go back and to fight over these past years, and to have this settlement, the city admitting that accountability was necessary is really really big. And so I think that just really emphasizing the team effort, and the lawyers being able to come and really lift us up.
Thank you. Any, go ahead.
This is Karen Savage, and I'm one of the reporters that was arrested. And I think to kind of follow what Blair has said, it's really important for us as reporters to report accurately. And if we are told something, to fact check it and to make sure that we are not just regurgitating disinformation, because PR doesn't just happen within corporations or within fossil fuel companies or drug companies. That happens from police, and it's our job to fact check that. And some of it's egregious. I mean, even just recently on the stand, they said they found piles of bricks that the protesters were going to throw. I was all over the place that day, didn't see any piles of bricks. But more stunningly is they couldn't produce any pictures of piles of bricks. And so it's that kind of stuff. And it happens in Baton Rouge, but it doesn't just happen here. It happens all across the country. And as reporters, I think that it's kind of just motivated me to be a better reporter and to not just, rely on what police say and not just to treat them as an authority, but to actually fact check that.
Yeah, this is Sherry, and if I could just piggyback off of that, I also was a reporter, an investigative reporter that day. No intention of going to jail. Had plans, but the idea that just because you go to a protest means that you're going to go to jail is insane to me, because under our Constitution, we have the right, not only as the press, as a member of the press, to be there and to report, but also as a citizen to express myself. Now, I didn't do that day, but I did want to clear up a couple things, because I've been watching what's been put out by the local Baton Rouge press, and I'm not really impressed, because when on the comments, there's a lot of things that are being said that I just want to clear up and make sure that people understand. Yes, we were all strip searched. We were taking in a group and strip searched together with different genders. That child, that 17-year-old at that time, yes, she was strip searched. And they did not just look under her band. We had to take off all of our clothes. We had to bend down. We had to make noises. We were in a situation where we were dehumanized as people, as humans. That was not a regular process. And that's just one of the many things that happened there. So I wanted to clear that up. I also want to clear up, no one was on the highway. No one was blocking the street. They had told us to get out of the street. We got out. They told us to get off the sidewalk. We got off the sidewalk. We were allowed to be in this person's property because she asked us to be there. And then when we went there, they still went in and got us. Why? Because that was the plan. That's why they had internal affairs hold back in the first place, because they didn't want them to see what they had planned to do with us, planned to the point of having affidavits ready to go with lives. Okay, I wanted that to be very clear. Now, a lot of people are going to talk about color in this issue. It's always about that, and that is very true. But the color here that I'm worried about is blue. Because if the color blue, the people who choose in our society to protect the law are above the law, then there is no law, and there is no equality, and there is no justice for people. So that being said, I have one more thing that I want to say, and I really want this. Now, I didn't go into this for money. I don't care about money. What I care about is the protection of the First Amendment rights for the people of this country, and that fair and accurate news is produced. And if you want to talk about fake news, then you should look at your local police department, because I can tell you they are the fakest news organization out there. And I don't believe it when they talk about Tyree Nichols, and I don't believe it when they talk about Tortuga in Atlanta, who was just killed and shot 13 times. I do not believe them, and I will never believe them again. And that is the worst part. Is because all of us, every one of us plaintiffs, we lost that day more than just ourselves. We lost what we believed was protection under the law. And it wasn't this one-time thing. It was set up that way. And we need people to know that. Last thing for real. Governor John Bel Edwards, you owe us an apology. That very next day, you came out and said that they used an accurate amount of force. You didn't know that. You didn't ask us. You didn't talk to us. You just believed that line, and you furthered that. And you were wrong, sir. And I'll be expecting the email.
Thank you, Sheree.
Last thing, for real, thank you. I just want to say thank you to our lawyers, because when I walked out of that jail that day into the hands of people that were waiting there for us because they saw what happened to us, I didn't think there would ever be justice for us. I didn't think it was possible. And you were the one group that gave us a little bit of hope that there was still a little bit of realness to this country. And I just want to say thank you for all the time, and thank you for the sleepless nights, and thank you for just being there for us and listening to us and believing us, because so many people didn't. You're number one in my book and all of our book, I guarantee.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add, there was one thing that Sheree mentioned that brought me back to that moment. It wasn't the front page that John Bell Edwards said that. I worked with the unions in New Orleans to get him elected because I believe he was bringing change to the state, literally months before I got arrested. So to see in the front page, the person that I believed in say that they used, I think it was appropriate force, if I'm not mistaken were his words, is just a slap to the face. So Sheree, I'm with you. I'm waiting for that apology.
Well, thank you everybody for being here. Any other questions for our team or any other comments?
I have a quick comment that we're also, some of the plaintiffs are looking at making donations to local organizations that do direct aid in Baton Rouge. That we, appreciate the settlement being a statement of accountability, but some of us are choosing to do that. Being that a lot of us don't live in the city anymore because we don't feel safe in the city anymore. So that was just something I think to add.
Thank you. All right, well, I'm going to put into the chat my email address, my phone number, in case there's follow-up questions, and I'm going to put the Dropbox link again. Let us know if you need anything or have any follow-up questions, and then we'll take it from there. So thank you to everyone for your time. Particular thank you to the plaintiffs for your continued fight in this over the last 7 years, and we look forward to the next step in accountability.